Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's great to see three such prominent members of the finance community at an event on the sidelines of COP30. So let's start. The economist Herman Daly famously said that the economy is the wholly owned subsidiary of nature and not the reverse. But we've seen that governments are reluctant to put a price on nature. How exactly can banks in this environment build an investment thesis in such a fragmented policy landscape? Let's start with you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. There is a race to put an economic price on nature, and the reason is because often, I mean, you look at this beautiful picture, standing forests have great short-term economic value, and we need to convert that to long-term economic value. We need to put a price on making that shift. And, you know, it is unfortunate because the moment in time now that puts valuations on forestry or on fishing stocks is short-term in nature, and we have to shift that. And so to do that, we need to come up with, and the finance community needs to come up with innovative ways to do that. That could take forms of carbon credits that was discussed earlier. It could be innovative financing mechanisms such as impact bonds, financing acceleration of carbon credit creation, the TFF facility that has been launched or will be launched here at COP30. So there's a lot of mechanisms that we can use to help shift that value. I mean, you know, it's be it forestry, be it fishing, having finance mechanisms put value on that is just so important. I mean, just one example comes to mind. We worked on a debt swap for Bahamas, and that really created a marine protected area that stopped short-term fishing and put value on creation of protection of that area for a longer term perspective. And so I just think there's so many different mechanisms that we can use to make that transition.
Indeed. And Gissell, you've been involved in building up a lot of these projects at JPMorgan. Can you just talk to us a little bit about your experience, some of the projects you've worked on, and how you think we can make these projects both bankable and scalable?
Thank you, John. Look, I think to set a price on nature, we first need to look at the components of one, demand, supply, and then if you have these two components, then financing will follow. So on the demand side, we have very clear signals from large technology companies such as Amazon, Microsoft signing long-term offtake agreements for nature. And so that is a very strong demand sign. The second one on supply, we see a lot of developers. However, not all have the same quality. But for those developers that can secure a high quality credit and that can make the project profitable without any concessionary support, then the project economics make sense. Once you have those two components, then financing will follow. And one company that has done this pretty well is Chestnut Carbon. Earlier this year, we announced an innovative project finance for a carbon removal project in the US. It was the first of its kind, it was the largest of its kind, and without no concessionary support, it was done in standard financing terms.
And we were right there by your side.
Hilen, if I could turn to you, I mean, obviously one of the overriding factors when you're trying to build up these projects is the notion of risk. And the risk can take many different forms, right? And one of those forms is that we're seeing increasingly extreme weather. We're seeing wildfires, we're seeing storms. We had Melissa pass through the Caribbean just a week ago. How are you looking at that, and how can investors control for those kind of risks?
So I think that I would like to first, I will talk about risk, but let me complement one thing that is critical for all these products that put a price on nature, which is basically the KPI, the impact that we're looking for. And one of the main deliverables that we're bringing to COP as MDBs, as a group of MDBs, is a common taxonomy of what nature finance is, because it could be fisheries, it could be mangroves, it could be also carbon credits. There's a variety of investments that are linked to nature, and having a common taxonomy is the first thing. But the second thing, to be able to design a product, a financing product, we have to have clarity on what KPIs are we using. And in our examples of the debt swaps that we did in Bahamas from the public sector side, and even ourselves working with private companies, the definition of those KPIs takes a long time. There are more than 600 KPIs being used. And so we came all together, all the MDBs, and decided that we needed to have clarity, a guide for practitioners to say, if you want to respond, basically manage the risk or plant trees, we have to have one type of KPIs. But there are other KPIs that are linked to pressure on the environment, and the other one is the state of the nature, right? And so having clarity and having examples of what's basically the theory of change is very important. So we're launching that at COP30 next week in Belém. But in terms of risk, part of the issue when we work with banks and with clients is for them to understand that right now is not only for them to see the impact that they can have on the environment, but also how the environment is impacting on them. And frameworks like TNFD or TCFD or ISSB are very useful to engage with private clients, for them to look at how the climate risk or the nature risk will affect their business, their bottom line. And when you do that, they start understanding that they have to take care of nature.
Brilliant. And just for the audience, please, I'm looking for questions, so if you have any, just scan the QR code and we'll take those and put them to our panel.
May I add something on just
yes,
on the risk
Donna,
point? This is my 5th COP now. I mean, my first one was back in Scotland, and when I think back on those days versus today, I think the private sector is so much closer to the public sector. We've developed so much over the last 5 years, and forums like this have really helped advance those conversations. And what that means is that we're able to work earlier, sooner, faster with the MDB community to help de-risk things. And the universe has expanded. Corporates are now involved. We spoke about insurance companies are coming in earlier, philanthropic organizations, and that's enabling everyone to figure out how to de-risk a project much earlier, much faster, much better, and that's a huge change over the last 5 years.
That's true.
I'm glad you talk about that, and particularly the demand side of the equation, I think, is something that needs to be addressed here. Gissell, how are you seeing demand currently? I mean, obviously, we're operating in a different geopolitical environment now. We're seeing a number of technological changes, whether it be AI or data centers. How do you see that, and where do you see the big elements of demand coming from for these markets?
So demand over the couple of years in the carbon credits market has evolved dramatically, right? Before, you had some what Bloomberg called behavioral purchases, where were driven by companies trying to offer avoidance solutions to retail customers. Now, what we see is a shift towards very high quality. And what do I mean by high quality? These are credits that have permanence, that are additional, that have certain co-benefits, that means benefits to the communities surrounding the project. And so those credits are harder, they're more expensive to develop, and so demand has moved towards those credits, right? And you have first movers such as Frontier, you have first movers as the tech companies. So that's where the demand is going, and I think that is where we need to grow from now onwards. And frankly, a lot of institutions like Microsoft has been a first mover in this space. They've said, this is what I consider a high quality. And it has set the bar really high, but I think developers are moving towards there. And with AI data centers, you are probably going to have more emissions, right? Because we're going to use more power, and the grids are still not fully decarbonized. So as a result, we're going to have more emissions. And so as especially hyperscalers move towards fulfilling their net zero commitments, then you're going to see more demand for high quality credits.
Brilliant. Let's turn to the COP30 summit a little bit. One of the key initiatives that Brazil, the presidency of the COP30, is putting forward is the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And that is one of the, a lot of people are saying that's incredibly innovative. It's going to be rewarding countries that have standing forests to keep those forests standing. How are you thinking about that in the banking community, and what advice would you be giving going into COP30? Let's start with you, Hilen.
So I think that it's a very innovative instrument that we needed to develop, and as always, to develop these types of initiatives takes time. That's why COP30 presidency had to put a lot of effort on bringing this home, right? From our perspective, understanding and designing bankable projects around this idea is something that we have to start with. So we are supporting with IDB, supporting with technical assistance for them to be able to design what type of investments can be then bankable, hopefully later on, not at a concessional state, because what will take root and it will be long-lasting is if it can become a commercial state, right? But right now, I think that the idea of having this large pot of resources that can support and reward countries for their standing tropical forests is a very important signal, and it can be complemented with all this type of work that we have learned in other areas, right? There's a lot of learning that has been done in renewables energy, for example, where 10, 15 years ago we needed concessional resources, and today is basically commercially viable. So hopefully the forestry conversation will also end up being a commercially viable conversation in a few years with the starting of this mechanism.
And Donna, how do you see the role for Standard Chartered or banks in general?
I mean, specifically to the TFFF facility, I think it's important to understand it's an incredible reward system. I mean, we're hopeful that 70 plus countries are rewarded for restricting their deforestation, below a certain threshold. But that being said, if it's successful, and I think this is an important point, the math is kind of working out, depending on how it plays out, something like roughly paying out $4 per hectare. That's nowhere near the value of this beautiful forestry. So I think we need to think about that as incremental value to reward countries that stop deforestation. And I think the TFFF facility can be used in combination with other financing mechanisms such as carbon credits. But I think we need to think about it as incremental, and I think that's fine and that's good because we have to start now, and it's it may not be perfect. But if we don't start and tackle this issue, then we won't get anywhere. So I think it's important to think of that as incremental.
Great. We do have a question from our Q&A. How can financial institutions finance, invest in, and support projects to ensure that they have high integrity? Gissell, if I come to you on that one.
So look, let's take a step back and let's look from a financial perspective. What are the risks that we need to mitigate, right? So the first one is obviously revenue risk, right? And so for us, it's very important to see who the off-taker is. So in this case, if it's an investment-grade counterparty, that's amazing because that means that we can finance and lever that purchase agreement. The second thing that we look at is what is the carbon yield of the project, meaning what is the mortality risk of that forest? What is the growth risk of that forest? The third thing that we need to look at is land acquisition. Is the land there on an affordable basis to acquire, because you need large plots of land, and does the company have an effective way to identify its plots of land? That's where AI, for example, is extremely useful. Then the fourth thing is nature risk, right? This is, at the end of the day, this is a live asset. And so you need to account for the risk related to wildfires, convective storm. Can this wipe out the plot of land where I'm putting my trees? And then are there insurance solutions, like such as parametric insurance, to mitigate or reduce some of those risks? And so once we look at that package, then we can say, okay, is this financeable, right? Does the economic make sense? And then, of course, as an added value, we look at, okay, does the project that has co-benefits, right? Does it follow the do no harm rules at all the banks at year 2? And so if those packages make sense and the returns are there, the financing will be there, right? And on Chestnut, for example, that's where we had a lot of success because, again, it was high quality, followed the Microsoft standards, it had a Microsoft offtake, and so once we packaged that up in a project finance loan, then when we went to the banks, the demand was there.
So there's a new report that's out today that says banks have arranged more than $425 billion of financing for companies contributing the most to deforestation since the Paris Agreement was announced almost a decade ago. How do we change that equation? How do we stop that from happening? How do we build up the nature markets? I don't know if one of you would like to take that, Dana. Yeah.
Look, I think it's critical. I mean, we operate in 52 markets, many of them which are the most biodiverse countries. And so we have to be part of that solution. And I think we touched on bringing first of its kind transactions to market where we can change that equation is so critical. And I think organizations such as ours that have the liberty to experiment and push the boundaries of what financial institutions can do will help close that gap.
We have a, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that I think that at least the MDBs, we have committed to support countries in their NDCs, and we have the commitment to align and support our financing to the country's commitments, not only in the NDC, but long-term strategy. That is why the supporting and the presentation of the NDC 3.0 is so critical, because I think it's not only the private sector developing these projects, but the signaling from the public sector that this is relevant, that there are the enabling conditions in place, and that there is a commitment, a long-term commitment of the country is very important for us to then be able to finance and structure these types of deals.
Brilliant. We do have one more question on the Q&A, which I think is very relevant. Do we need perfect pricing of nature to drive investments to projects, or is there enough information that markets are financing the projects that will deliver the greatest value? It seems to be a question on transparency and data and the like.
I would love perfect, but we can't let it get in the way of progress. Some instruments, I think, are very elegant of pricing and trying to be very data-driven. For instance, impact bonds that only pay for specific, measurable, audited outcomes are a beautiful instrument to ensure you're trying to price in that nature risk or the nature progress as data-driven as possible. But and that's wonderful. But I also don't want to stop progress.
Great, we have 1 minute left, so I'd just like to take the view of our panelists about the 1 or 2 things that this COP can deliver that banks will be looking for to help boost nature markets and carbon markets. So starting with you, Hilen, a few words.
Yeah, one of the first things that I think Odile mentioned it in the panel before is this is the COP of implementation, right? So we want to see examples. We want to see how we can provide more instruments, more structures that can allow for the financial flows that are needed to respond to this crisis. We as MDBs are going to support and present a paper on all the different innovations that we're doing, specifically on adaptation in this case, but many of these adaptation solutions are a link between nature and climate, which is very important to bear in mind. So having examples and understanding and learning from each other is one of the main things that I think this COP should bring to the table.
Brilliant. And Gissell, in a couple of words?
For me, it will be the implementation of the TFFF. I think it has a lot of application and it's very scalable.
Great. And Donna, to finish off.
I would love countries to be brave with their national determined contributions and think about how Article 6 and carbon credits can play a part of that.
Brilliant. And on that note, thanks very much to my panelists. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.